"It's cold. It's just the two of us. There's no other option," said the young Apache woman, trembling. The cold bit through Aeon's thin clothes like tiny knives, but it was more than the winter air. It was the fear that made her shiver. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked at Takoda, her younger brother, who clung to her arm. His small body trembled, his teeth chattering as he tried to speak but could not. "It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other option," Aeon whispered again, as if saying it aloud would make the truth any easier to bear. But the words hung in the icy air, heavy and sharp. The snow around them stretched like an endless white desert. Trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like silent witnesses to their struggle. Footprints, their own, marked the path they had taken, tiny impressions in a world that seemed vast and merciless. The wind howled through the mountains, bending the frozen branches and carrying whispers of the dangers that lurked unseen. Wolves, perhaps, or the deeper threat of hunger, exhaustion, and cold that could strike even without warning. Aeon scanned the horizon. The sun had just risen, pale and weak, barely lighting the world below. The mountains were steep, jagged, and covered with thick snow, hiding crevices and slippery rocks that could make any step deadly. Yet they had no choice but to move forward. Their village, once full of laughter and warmth, had been destroyed weeks ago by raiders. Smoke had risen in the distance, carrying the scent of burning homes, and the sound of screams haunted Aeon even now. She remembered how her parents had fallen, how the older men had tried to fight, and how she had grabbed Takoda and run before the chaos swallowed them both. The memory made her stomach knot. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the present. Takoda's small hand tightened around hers, his icy fingers stiff and trembling. "Aeon, are we safe?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. She knelt beside him, brushing the snow from his hair. "We are together, Takoda," she said. "That is what matters. We will find shelter soon, I promise." Her words were more for herself than for him. She had no clear idea where the next safe place was. All she knew were the survival lessons her parents had taught her: how to track animals, how to read the sky, how to find water and firewood. But those lessons had been taught in the gentle warmth of their village, not in the harsh, frozen wilderness where every step could be the last. The snow was deep, and every movement took effort. Each breath came in white clouds, and the cold crept into their bones, refusing to leave. Yet Aeon refused to let fear dominate them. She had to appear strong for Takoda, even if her heart was pounding with worry. They walked slowly, carefully choosing their steps. Aeon led the way, scanning for broken trees that might provide cover or signs of animals that could indicate food nearby. Takoda followed, his small footprints sometimes slipping and disappearing in the deeper snow. Every so often, Aeon would stop, crouching low to examine tracks that were not theirs. Some belonged to deer, a hopeful sign, while others, like larger paw prints, made her blood run cold. Wolves. The thought forced her to tighten her grip on the small knife at her waist. It was not much, but it was all they had. Still, she knew that often the cold and hunger were more dangerous than any predator. Hours passed. The wind intensified, cutting across their faces and turning the snow into sharp needles that stung their skin. Aeon felt her own energy fading. Her legs burned from walking, her feet soaked and numb, but she refused to let Takoda know how weak she was. She kept talking to him, telling stories of their village, of the games they had played as children, of the river where they had swum in the summer. Her voice was soft, sometimes trembling, but it kept the fear at bay. Takoda's small smiles, brief but bright, were enough to give her strength to keep moving. By mid-afternoon, the siblings reached the edge of a small clearing. The snow here was thinner, and a few hardy pines provided partial shelter from the wind. Aeon dropped to the ground, exhausted, and began to gather small branches and fallen leaves to make a fire. Takoda helped, collecting what he could, though his small hands struggled with the cold. They worked silently together, understanding each other without words. Finally, Aeon struck two stones together. Sparks flew, landing on the dry leaves. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny flame appeared, trembling and weak like them. She blew gently, nurturing it until it became a small fire. The warmth wrapped around them, a fragile shield against the biting cold. Sitting close to the fire, Aeon studied Takoda. His cheeks were red from the cold, his lips chapped. He looked so small, so fragile, yet there was something stubborn in his eyes, a spark of courage she admired. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "We will make it, Takoda. We have to. We have each other, and that is enough." He nodded, resting his head against her shoulder. The moment was brief, fragile, but it gave her hope. She knew the real danger had only begun, but surviving the night would be the first victory. As darkness approached, the cold became more unbearable. Aeon built a small lean-to against a fallen tree to shield them from the wind. She wrapped Takoda in layers of clothing she had managed to save, and then she wrapped herself around him as best she could. The snow fell softly, covering them as if trying to bury them under its weight. She whispered stories from their village, stories of courage, kindness, and hope. She spoke of the elders, of the lessons that had kept their people alive for generations. Takoda listened quietly, lulled into temporary sleep by her words and the warmth of the fire. But sleep was fleeting. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind made Aeon's heart race. She could not afford to rest fully, not when danger might come in the night. She kept watch, her eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. She remembered her father's words, "Fear is natural, Aeon, but it cannot rule you." The strongest survive not by being fearless, but by acting despite fear. She repeated these words to herself over and over like a mantra as she held Takoda close. Night stretched endlessly and the fire burned low. Aeon added more twigs and small branches, keeping it alive, keeping hope alive. She thought of their village, of friends and family they had lost. The memories were painful, but they were also a source of strength. They reminded her why she had to survive, for herself, for Takoda, for those who could not. The wind outside continued its relentless howl, but inside the small circle of firelight they were safe for now. In the quiet moments, Aeon allowed herself to reflect. She was young, yes, but she carried more responsibility than many adults. She had to think ahead, plan, and act. Every choice mattered, every path she took. Every decision about food, fire, and shelter could mean life or death. Yet in that moment, as she watched Takoda sleep fitfully, she felt a flicker of pride in her own strength. She had survived thus far, and she would continue to survive. The cold could be merciless, but so could she. The night seemed endless, but eventually, Aeon drifted into a light, restless sleep. The fire continued to burn, small and steady, like a heartbeat in the frozen wilderness. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, indifferent to human struggle. But inside that fragile circle of warmth, two siblings clung to each other, alive and determined. They were alone, yes, but not powerless. They had each other, and for now, that was enough. And as Aeon whispered one last promise into the dark, she felt a tiny spark of hope flicker inside her. They would survive this winter, no matter what it demanded. The morning light barely pierced the heavy clouds as Aeon and Takoda stirred from their fitful sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cold had crept back into their bodies. Takoda rubbed his eyes and yawned, shivering as he tried to stretch out the stiffness in his small limbs. Aeon gently shook him awake, her own muscles aching, her body still weak from the night spent guarding him and the fire. "Come on, Takoda," she whispered. "We need to keep moving before the snow piles higher and the cold grows worse." Takoda nodded, his teeth chattering, and pulled his thin clothing tighter. Aeon scanned the area around their temporary shelter. The small clearing offered little protection from the wind, but it had been enough to keep them alive through the night. She knew they could not linger here long. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and the snow made it almost impossible to find food without venturing into the unknown. She studied the footprints from the day before, thinking about which direction might offer water, edible roots, or game. Every choice was dangerous, but doing nothing was deadlier. They set off slowly, Aeon leading the way, Takoda following close behind. Each step was a struggle. The snow sank deep, sometimes up to their knees, making every movement exhausting. Aeon thought about the lessons her parents had taught her: how to step lightly, how to test the ground for hidden dangers, how to move quietly to avoid predators. She reminded Takoda to do the same, showing him how to watch his footprints, how to feel the snow under his feet, how to keep breathing steadily to conserve energy. He nodded seriously, trying to mimic her movements, and she felt a surge of pride. Even in his fear, he wanted to learn and survive. Hours passed, and the cold bit more fiercely as the wind rose. The siblings were forced to rest frequently, crouching under trees or behind snowdrifts. Aeon rubbed Takoda's hands, trying to warm them and keep his blood flowing. "Do you remember the story of the hawk, Takoda?" she asked softly, trying to keep his mind off the cold. He nodded, listening intently. She told him how the hawk had survived the storms by finding shelter, being patient, and never giving up. "We are like the hawk," she whispered. "We may be small, but we are smart and we know how to survive." Takoda smiled faintly, the smallest light of hope warming them both in the frozen landscape. As they moved forward, Aeon noticed tracks in the snow. They were small, quick, and cautious. "Deer," she murmured, pointing. She studied the tracks carefully, judging their direction. If they could follow them, perhaps they would find food or at least fresh water. But she also knew that following tracks was dangerous. It could lead them into predators, thin ice, or steep cliffs. She weighed the risk, her mind racing with possibilities, but hunger and thirst left them no choice. They had to take chances to survive. Following the tracks brought them through denser forest, where the trees were thick and the snow was slightly lighter. Birds flitted nervously above, startled by the crunch of their steps. Aeon stopped frequently, listening for danger, scanning the shadows for movement. Takoda whispered questions about the animals and the forest, and Aeon answered as best she could. She explained how the forest gave life and took life, how the lessons of the elders were not just for hunting, but for understanding nature itself. Takoda absorbed every word, his eyes wide with curiosity and determination. By midday, their small fire had long since burned out, and their stomachs screamed in protest. Aeon spotted a cluster of low shrubs and moved toward them carefully, hoping to find roots or berries. She dug through the snow with her hands, revealing small, frost-covered roots. They were bitter but edible. She handed some to Takoda, who nibbled cautiously. "Not much, but it will help," she said. She ate a few herself, feeling the cold shrink slightly from her body as the meager nourishment settled in her stomach. Survival was about small victories, and they celebrated quietly with a nod and a brief smile, knowing that every bit counted. As they continued, the day grew colder and the wind stronger. Snowflakes fell thick and heavy, covering their tracks and making it harder to see. Aeon adjusted Takoda's clothing, wrapping extra layers around him as best she could. Her own fingers were stiff and numb, but she ignored the pain, focusing on him. She knew that if she faltered, Takoda would falter too. They needed each other more than ever, and she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She whispered words of encouragement, telling him that they were strong, that they could do this, that the forest, though harsh, was not unbeatable. Suddenly, they heard a crack, a sound that made Aeon freeze. She listened intently, her heart pounding. Takoda clutched her arm, fear evident in his wide eyes. The sound came again, a branch snapping under the weight of snow, or perhaps an animal moving nearby. Aeon's hand went instinctively to her knife, her body tense and ready. She whispered for Takoda to stay calm, reminding him to breathe slowly, to stay behind her. Together, they moved cautiously toward a small rise, seeking higher ground where they could see better. The fear was real, but so was their determination. At the top of the rise, Aeon spotted a narrow stream, partially frozen but flowing. Water meant survival. Relief washed over her briefly, but she knew reaching it would be another challenge. The snow was deeper here and the bank was slippery. She carefully guided Takoda down, showing him where to step and how to balance. Each movement required patience and focus. Takoda stumbled once, catching himself on a rock, and Aeon felt a surge of protective instinct. She encouraged him, reminding him that every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. By late afternoon, they had reached the stream. Aeon helped Takoda drink carefully, showing him how to avoid the ice patches. She collected some snow to melt in a small depression of the frozen ground, careful to avoid contaminated water. As they rested by the stream, Aeon scanned the area for potential shelter. She knew night would come again, and without a safe place, the cold could kill them. Her eyes caught a small cave, partially hidden by snow and trees. It wasn't much, but it offered protection from the wind and a place to make another fire. They moved toward the cave as quickly as possible, Takoda stumbling but never giving up. Aeon felt her own energy draining, but she refused to show it. She knew she had to stay strong, not just physically but emotionally. When they reached the cave, she cleared snow from the entrance and made a small area inside where they could sit. She gathered dry branches and leaves, building a fire carefully. The flames flickered to life, throwing warm light across their pale faces. Takoda smiled weakly, eyes reflecting hope for the first time that day. Aeon felt a wave of relief, mixed with exhaustion. They had survived another day in the wilderness, but tomorrow would bring new challenges. As night fell, the siblings huddled close to the fire. Takoda asked about the stars, and Aeon told him the stories her parents had once told her, stories of heroes, of cleverness, and of resilience. She wanted him to remember that even in the darkest times, hope existed. She also told him about the importance of patience and careful observation, lessons that the wilderness demanded. He listened intently, and she could see that despite fear and cold, he was learning, growing stronger in spirit. Sleep came reluctantly. Aeon stayed awake longer, keeping watch while Takoda rested. The wind outside continued its relentless howl, snow falling in thick layers against the cave. Every sound was amplified in the quiet, the creak of ice, the distant howl of an animal, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Aeon held her knife close, ready for anything. Fear was never far from her mind, but she knew that courage was not the absence of fear. It was action despite it. And she would act, no matter how exhausted she became, to keep her brother safe. By the time Aeon allowed herself to rest, the fire had burned down to embers and the cave offered the faintest warmth. She pressed herself against Takoda, sharing what little heat she had. He nestled against her, comforted by her presence. Together they were small but fierce, fragile but determined. They had survived hunger, exhaustion, and fear today. The snow outside continued to fall, covering the world in white, but inside the cave, two siblings clung to life and hope, ready to face another day. The night in the small cave was long and restless. Aeon lay beside Takoda, listening to the faint sounds of the snowstorm outside. The wind rattled the trees and the snow shifted against the mountainside. Every snap of a branch, every subtle creak of ice made her heart beat faster. Takoda stirred, murmuring in his sleep, and she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered softly. "I'm here. Nothing will hurt us while we stay together." Even as she spoke, she knew that danger waited beyond the cave, hidden and unseen. Yet she could not show fear, not in front of him. She had to be the shield, the guide, the protector. By dawn, the storm had subsided slightly, leaving a world coated in thick snow and mist. The siblings emerged from their cave, blinking against the bright white of the morning. The wind was still sharp, but it carried a sense of calm after the storm's fury. Aeon looked at Takoda, noticing the exhaustion in his small frame. His cheeks were red from cold, his eyes tired, but there was a resilience there she admired. She knelt beside him, brushing snow from his hair. "We'll keep moving," she said gently. "We have to find more food and a safer place to rest tonight." He nodded silently, trusting her completely. They set off through the forest, the snow crunching beneath their feet. Aeon moved slowly, careful to conserve energy, careful to avoid hidden dangers. She scanned every shadow, every tree, and every patch of snow for signs of animals or potential threats. Takoda followed closely, mimicking her steps. Occasionally, she stopped to teach him how to test the ground for thin ice, how to identify animal tracks, and how to listen for subtle sounds in the wilderness. He absorbed everything, his young mind learning quickly, though fatigue made him stumble often. Aeon would lift him gently, reminding him to keep his strength and focus. By midday, their small supply of roots and snow water was gone, leaving them hungry and thirsty once again. Aeon spotted a deer track near a partially frozen stream. She crouched to examine it, studying the direction and size. She whispered to Takoda about the possibility of finding food, keeping her voice low to avoid scaring the deer away. "If we follow it carefully, we might have something to eat," she said. Takoda's eyes widened with hope. Hunger had been gnawing at him all morning, but the idea of food gave him a burst of energy. Together, they followed the tracks, moving slowly and quietly through the thickening snow. The tracks led them over a ridge and into a denser part of the forest. The snow was deeper here, and visibility was limited. Aeon's heart raced with every step. The risk of injury or getting lost was higher than ever. She reminded Takoda to stay close, to watch the footprints carefully, and to remain silent. The forest around them seemed alive, with the wind bending branches and sending snowflakes swirling in the air. Aeon thought of her parents, of the lessons they had taught her, and she whispered them again to Takoda. "We are part of this land. Respect it, observe it, and it will guide us." He nodded, his fear mixed with fascination. Suddenly a sound shattered the quiet, a low growl from behind. Aeon froze, recognizing it instantly. Wolves. Her heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed Takoda's hand and whispered sharply, "Stay close. Don't make a sound." The growl came again, louder this time, and she realized they had been spotted. She scanned the trees, trying to find a branch or rock to defend themselves if needed. Takoda clung to her, his small body trembling. Aeon's mind raced. Running could provoke the wolves, but staying still might be just as dangerous. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her. Act with caution, but act with courage. She whispered again, "We will move slowly, step by step. Trust me." Holding Takoda's hand tightly, Aeon began to back away from the sound, carefully choosing each step to avoid noise. Her knife was ready, though she hoped it would not be needed. The wolves circled, their eyes glinting in the shadows, but they did not attack immediately. Aeon led Takoda toward a fallen tree, low enough to hide behind but sturdy enough to provide some protection. She crouched, breathing heavily but silently, whispering to Takoda, "We are quiet. We are still. They will not see us." For what felt like an eternity, the wolves circled, sniffing the snow. Finally, they retreated, likely distracted by easier prey elsewhere. Aeon exhaled slowly, relief washing over her, though she knew danger was never far in the wilderness. After the encounter, they pressed on, more cautiously than before. Their journey led them to a partially frozen river. Water meant survival, and the flowing stream offered hope. Aeon knelt and broke through the ice carefully, letting Takoda drink. She collected a small amount to use for cooking, though they had no firewood at the moment. The cold was relentless, and she knew that finding shelter before nightfall was crucial. As they rested briefly, Takoda asked, "Aeon, will we ever see our village again?" Her heart tightened, and she gently squeezed his hand. "We will survive first. After that, we will see. What matters now is the moment. We must be strong for each other." Takoda nodded, understanding more than his words could express. As afternoon approached, they discovered a small clearing with fallen trees that could serve as shelter. Aeon examined the area carefully, noting possible hazards: loose snow, weak branches, and hidden ice patches. She led Takoda to the safest spot and began constructing a makeshift linta using branches and leaves. Takoda helped as best he could, carrying small twigs and stacking them carefully. They were silent for a while, their minds focused on survival. Aeon's body ached, but the determination to protect her brother pushed her forward. Step by step, they created a small, functional shelter. The first night in the new shelter was tense. The wind whipped outside, shaking the makeshift structure. Aeon built a small fire in the center, blowing gently until the flames caught. The warmth spread slowly and Takoda's shivering eased. They huddled close, sharing whatever warmth they could. Aeon kept watch as usual, listening for the faintest sound of danger, cracking ice, shifting snow, or predator movement. She whispered stories to Takoda, hoping to ease his fear. She spoke of their ancestors, of clever hunters, and of brave women who survived against impossible odds. Takoda listened, his eyes wide but comforted by her presence. Late that night, a new challenge arose. Snow began falling heavily again, covering their shelter and pressing against the lean-to. Aeon woke to the sound of snow sliding from the trees, threatening to bury their fire. She pushed aside the falling snow, keeping the embers alive. Takoda woke frightened and she held him tightly. "It's all right," she whispered. "We are together. Nothing can harm us while we stay strong." The storm lasted hours and Aeon's arms grew tired, but she did not rest. She had learned the hard way that survival required constant vigilance. Finally, the storm eased, leaving a quiet, snow-covered forest around them. The next morning, Aeon realized that they needed to move again. Food was running low, and staying in one place for too long could be dangerous. She packed their meager supplies, wrapped Takoda tightly in layers of clothing, and led him toward the mountains where game might be found. They climbed carefully, step by step, each movement measured. Aeon encouraged Takoda with gentle words, praising his courage and reminding him that every effort kept them alive. Despite exhaustion, fear, and hunger, they pressed forward together, step by step, day by day. By midday, they spotted fresh deer tracks leading into a narrow valley. Aeon studied the tracks carefully, noting the direction and depth of the impressions. The deer were likely close. She crouched and whispered instructions to Takoda. "Move quietly, stay low, follow exactly as I do." He nodded, copying her movements with seriousness beyond his years. The siblings moved as one, careful, patient, and alert. Their bond, strengthened by shared struggle, became their greatest strength. Each glance and silent gesture communicated more than words ever could. Finally, as the sun began to sink, they reached the valley where the deer tracks ended. Aeon crouched, scanning for movement, and saw the herd grazing near a frozen pond. Her heart lifted slightly. They might have food soon. But the danger was real. The valley was narrow and escape routes were limited. She whispered to Takoda, "We must be patient. Wait for the right moment." Hours passed, and the siblings watched and waited, learning from the quiet world around them. Each heartbeat, each breath, was a reminder that survival was as much about patience as it was about courage. Night fell again, and Aeon made another fire, keeping it small and controlled. Takoda huddled close, exhausted but attentive. Aeon reflected on their journey, the fear, the hunger, the near-death moments, and the small victories that had carried them through. She realized that survival was not just about physical strength. It was about courage, intelligence, patience, and love. She held Takoda close, whispering promises and lessons, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to prove their resilience. The next morning, Aeon awoke to the faint light of dawn creeping through the trees. Takoda lay beside her, curled tightly for warmth, his breath visible in the cold air of their small shelter. The night had been restless again. The wind howled through the forest, rattling branches and shaking the lean-to. Aeon rubbed her eyes and forced herself to rise, aware that the day ahead would demand every ounce of strength and focus she had left. They had survived storms, wolves, hunger, and exhaustion, but she knew the real test was coming. The mountains beyond the valley promised food and water, but they also hid treacherous paths, deep snow, and the unknown dangers of winter. She nudged Taco to awake. "Time to move," she whispered. His small face looked up at her, eyes still sleepy, but determination shone faintly. "I'm ready," he said. Aeon smiled faintly, proud of his courage. She had always known he was brave, but these trials had forced him to grow faster than most children ever had to. They packed the small supplies they had left, roots, dried leaves, and snow for water, carefully wrapping them in cloth to keep them dry. Every item mattered. Every bit of energy spent carrying it was necessary for survival. They set off slowly, climbing higher into the mountains. The snow grew deeper, and each step was a battle against fatigue and cold. Aeon led the way, her knife in one hand and Takota's hand in the other, guiding him over icy patches and around hidden holes. The cold was relentless, numbing their fingers and toes, but Aeon focused on each small step, teaching Takota to do the same. She whispered instructions constantly: how to place their feet on firm snow, how to balance, how to notice subtle changes in the terrain. Takota followed carefully, trusting her completely, even when fear and exhaustion threatened to overtake him. By midday, they came to a narrow ridge. Below, the valley stretched out, beautiful and dangerous, covered in untouched snow. Aeon scanned the path ahead, her heart racing. The ridge was slippery, and one wrong step could send them tumbling down into the rocks and ice far below. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. "Takota," she said, kneeling beside him, "stay close to me. We take it one step at a time. Watch my feet. Follow me exactly." He nodded, his small hand gripping hers tightly. She led the way slowly, testing the snow before each step, sometimes crawling when the incline was too steep. Takota mirrored her movements, his small frame tense but obedient. Halfway across the ridge, disaster struck. A patch of snow gave way beneath Aeon's foot. She fell forward, catching herself just in time with her hands gripping the frozen ground. Her knife slipped from her belt, clattering against the rocks below. Takota screamed, frozen in place. "It's all right," Aeon shouted, her voice steady despite the surge of fear inside her. She helped him inch closer to safer ground, one careful step at a time. The ridge was narrow, and the drop on either side was deadly. Each movement required intense concentration. Aeon's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let panic control her. She had learned long ago that fear could be just as dangerous as any physical threat. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the top of the ridge. Aeon exhaled, relief washing over her, though her body trembled from the effort. Takota collapsed beside her, shivering but unharmed. She wrapped him in extra layers and held him close, whispering encouragements and promises. "We did it," she said softly. "We are safe." For now, the fear still lingered, but they had survived another life-threatening challenge. It was a small victory, but in the wilderness, small victories were everything. As they rested, Aeon scanned the horizon. Beyond the ridge, she spotted the dark outline of a cave hidden in the mountainside. It could provide more permanent shelter and a safer place to make fire. She pointed it out to Takota. "That will be our goal," she said. "If we reach that cave, we can rest properly and plan our next steps, but the path will be difficult." He nodded, his face pale but determined. Together, they rose and began the long climb toward it. The journey to the cave was exhausting. Snow grew deeper, and the terrain became steeper. Aeon had to constantly check for hidden ice patches and weak snowdrifts that could collapse under their weight. Takota stumbled multiple times, and each time she caught him, holding him tightly and whispering words of encouragement. "You are stronger than you know," she said. "We can do this together." His small nods and occasional smiles gave her the strength to keep moving. They were tired, cold, and hungry, but their determination pushed them forward. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying a sound that made Aeon's heart leap. It was a distant howl, low and threatening. Wolves. She froze, scanning the area. The cave was close, but they were exposed in the open mountain slope. She grabbed Takoda's hand and whispered urgently, "We need to move carefully. Stay low. Do exactly as I do." They began to descend slightly toward a cluster of rocks that could provide temporary cover. Aeon's mind raced. She knew that a direct confrontation would be dangerous. They had no way to defend themselves against a pack of wolves. Patience, stealth, and speed were their only options. The wolves appeared from the tree line, their eyes glinting in the pale light. Aeon crouched low, guiding Takoda behind a boulder. The animals circled, sniffing the air. Aeon whispered instructions, teaching Takoda how to remain silent, how to breathe slowly, how to avoid sudden movements. The tension was unbearable. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, the wolves moved on, likely distracted by easier prey. Aeon exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. She pressed herself against Takoda, whispering words of comfort and praise. "You were brave," she said. "We survived. That is what matters." They pressed on toward the cave, carefully navigating the snow-covered slopes. By late afternoon, they reached its entrance. The cave was small but dry, sheltered from wind and snow. Aeon cleared snow from the floor and gathered dry branches and leaves to build a fire. Takoda helped, carrying small sticks and placing them near the flames. Together, they nurtured the fire until it grew strong enough to provide warmth. The glow of the flames reflected in their tired eyes. They were safe, at least for now, and the sense of relief was overwhelming. As night fell, Aeon and Takoda huddled close to the fire. Aeon reflected on the day, the near fall from the ridge, the wolf encounter, and the constant struggle against cold and hunger. She realized that their survival depended not only on skill but also on patience, courage, and their bond. She held Takoda tightly, whispering stories of their village, of ancestors who had survived harsh winters, of heroes who overcame impossible odds. Takoda listened quietly, comforted by her presence. He seemed to understand more deeply than ever that survival required not just physical strength, but courage of heart. Late into the night, the storm returned, heavy snow falling against the cave entrance. Aeon added more branches to the fire, keeping it alive against the bitter cold. She stayed awake, watching over Takoda, ensuring he remained warm and safe. Her body ached from the day's exertions, but she refused to rest fully. In the wilderness, one moment of carelessness could be fatal. Yet even in the fatigue, she felt a quiet pride. They had faced some of the most dangerous moments of their journey and had survived together. Their bond had grown stronger, their trust in each other unshakable. As the night deepened, Aeon allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought about how much they had endured, the storms, the hunger, the predators, the treacherous paths, and yet they were alive. She realized that survival was not just about reaching safety. It was about facing fear, trusting each other, and finding strength in moments of weakness. Takoda stirred beside her, murmuring in his sleep, and she pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "We will survive," she whispered. "Together we will survive."